Right, I have it as 1 o'clock, so I think we should get a start. Welcome everyone to this session of our series of webinars on the end of the EU transition period. This one in particular is for Part 147 holders. My name is Will Nathan. I'm Head of External Relations here at the Civil Aviation Authority. This webinar is one of a series of sessions we are running for all parts of the aviation industry and aerospace industry, and you can find more details of each of those webinars at info.caa.co.uk/EU exit. That's our dedicated microsite for all issues relating to the EU transition. Today, we'll be hearing from Mark Panton and Steve Horton on the issues affecting maintenance training organisations in a no-deal scenario. Just a couple of housekeeping things from me before we start. There will be time at the end for a Q&A session, but do feel free to submit these questions throughout the session using the button at the bottom of your screen. We won't answer them until the end of the session, but please do feel free as things come up that you think you need clarification on or want more details on using that function. And finally, we are recording these sessions and we'll be making them available to everyone who has a Part 147 approval after the session has been completed. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleagues, Mark, Steve, and Damien, who will run you through the session.
Okay. Julia, can we go to the first slides, please? So this takes you through the agenda. So we've got the new regulatory framework, the continued validity of the 147 approvals. What do I have to do for the 1st of January and what needs to be approved by the CAA? And then what are the other effects? And as already said, we go to a Q&A session at the end. So the first session is on the new regulatory framework. So this is really to bring you up to date on what the framework will be as we move from this year into 2021. Now, at the moment, we are currently in a transition period. We entered that on the 31st of January when we formally left the EU. And that continues until the 31st of December, when we officially leave the EU system. So there are currently the current rule set for the aviation continues to apply, as does all the agreements, EU agreements, including all the bilateral safety agreements. Now, as you're probably fully aware, negotiations are currently ongoing between the EU and the UK, and included in those is a future aviation relationship. But please note that at the end of the year, we will no longer be participating in the EASA system. So at the end of the transition period, our participation ends. Next slide, please. So EU legislation, well, we're talking now about the European Union Withdrawal Act of 2018. EU legislation will form part of our UK domestic law, but it is only that legislation that is in effect on the 31st of December. The total EU aviation acquis is being brought across into UK law under that Withdrawal Act. There are a number of statutory instruments, what you will hear is referred to SIs, that have been made under the Act, and this makes the EU legislation operable in the UK. Now, a couple of important points here. There's been no changes to the substantive requirements of the regulation, so the technical content remains unchanged, and there is no change to the identity of the regulations. So the regulations that you know today, and there's some examples there, they remain unchanged. Next slide, please. Now, as part of the work that we're doing and for going forward into 2021 and beyond, we are developing our own rulemaking and policy program. At the end of the transition period, we will be responsible for the development of aviation safety and regulation, and we are developing this capability from the start of 2021. So this provides an opportunity to improve how we develop aviation safety policy in the future, and to involve industry in that decision making and develop those rules more. There will be an annual published programme of change derived from a prioritisation of the various demands that are imposed on us. And we are currently developing the 2021 programme, and that will be published towards the end of this year. Changes for 2021 are likely to contain the completion of the implementation of a number of EU regulations, the ICAO SARPs, and some deregulatory measures for general aviation. I'll hand over to Mark to continue.
Thank you, Steve. That's great. So what I'm intending doing now is really running you through what it really means to yourself as 147 approval holders, and the things that you have to be careful about over the next couple of months, and what it really means for you going forward into the next chapter, shall we say, of the UK aviation industry. Now, the next slide, please. So, as Will mentioned at the very beginning, is that what we're doing here is really giving you a heads up on the worst case scenario. So, in situation of a no agreement. Obviously we understand that the trade discussions are still going on, and something may happen or may not happen at the end of the year. But at the moment, this is all giving you the information about a no deal situation or no agreement situation. Now, the next slide, please. So fundamentally, what is going to happen to your approval at the end of the year? Well, in real terms, nothing. Your approval will carry on. Your approval will still be valid. Your approval will still have the same level of privileges. The fundamental difference is that approval is no longer recognised in the EU. So to carry out maintenance training in the UK for UK licence holders, it will be the same as next month. In January, as it is today in the world that we live in today. So, as I say, the mutual recognition or the mutual acceptance of certificate of recognitions will stop at the end of the year. That is the fundamental difference with your approval. Other than that, you do not have to do any applications. You do not have to do any conversion. It is purely the CAA's issued approval certificate is still valid on the 1st of January, that the one that we've issued with you today. Next slide, please. In real terms, the main thing that you have to do to prepare yourself for the 1st of January is really changing the certificate of recognition certificates. So the format will change, and the format is going to be extremely subtle in its change, because the reality is the real main change is changing it from an EASA form 148 or 149 to a CAA form 148, 149. That needs to be done for the 1st of January. You understand that to ensure that it still remains legal within our legal basis, then you need to make this change. You cannot issue an EASA form 148 or 149 post the 1st of January unless you've got an EASA approval. So we need to ensure that all our maintenance training organisations make this change. Next slide, please. Now, as you can see from this slide here, these are the two templates for the two new forms, or the two new certificate of recognitions. again, as I said, very subtle changes. There is no real major change to what you're doing. As Steve spoke about earlier on, is that we have brought over all of the EU legislation with all its terminology and so forth, and we've brought that into the UK system. So this is a good example of how your world really does not change under this new legislation. You can see still the same references, the same terminology. The only thing that's really changed is we don't say member state, we don't say part of the European Union anymore, and an EASA form number has changed to CAA form number. Now the next slide, please. So normally we would expect you, if you made any changes like a template change or so forth, we would expect you to put that in immediately to us for approval with the exposition. However, in this circumstances, everybody's going to be doing the same thing. So your forms 148, 149 need to be changed. So we were not going to expect you to put that in for the 1st of January. So the next convenient exposition change, MTOE change, then you can incorporate the new templates into that exposition. So that then, that is really around making sure that we don't end up making a bottleneck at the CAA for approval. So we've already agreed that the simple fact is it has to happen on the 1st of January. So any course that you conduct and conclude after the 1st of January needs to be a CAA form 148, 149 issued. And you know, when we can catch up with the approval of those templates and the latest version of the exposition at your next convenient point. Next slide, please. So what else will happen after the 1st of January? Well, as I said, your approval will stay the same. You'll make subtle changes with your certificates of recognition. However, what you need to be cognizant of is the fact of the EU recognition will cease from the end of the year, and that will then mean that the business or commercial aspects of your business may be impacted, and therefore you need to make a decision by yourselves to decide whether you need an EASA third country approval to be able to continue to service EU license holders in EU countries. That is really important. That's not something that we can help you with. It's important that you understand what the impact to your organizations are, or your customers, sorry, and actually who you're actually providing trading to. So if it's an EU organization and those certificates have to be applied to EU licenses, then from the 1st of January onwards, the CAA form 148, 149 will not be acceptable. So that's why we encourage you to talk to EASA about getting a third country approval if that's what your business needs. In terms of the wider aspect of acceptance of certificate of recognition, then obviously there's other countries outside of the EU that use an EASA CFR as it stands today, and those countries, whether that be in Asia, whether that be in America or anywhere else you may do training, it's down to the local authority on whether they will accept a CAA form 148, 149. So it really requires you to talk to the individual organizations you're doing training for, or the individuals that are students on your courses, and actually trying to understand whether these new CAA form 148, 149s are acceptable for that local authority. We are happy to support you in trying to give you additional information, but it really is down to the local authority whether they will be acceptable or not. Next slide, please. So in terms of the recognition period we've got over the next 2 years, this recognition period, as it starts from the 1st of January onwards for the next 2 years, is really about trying to smooth the bumps, shall we say, trying to ensure that we don't end up with a cliff edge. So we've given legislation within the statutory instruments that Steve spoke about at the beginning of the webinar to be able to give the ability to be able to have EASA approved organisations carry on for a period of time to allow people to change over to the new system. So in real terms, what does that mean in the Part 66, Part 147 world? Well, UK licence holders will still be able to use EU issued C of Rs to be able to apply that to a UK Part 66 licence. If someone's doing training within a European authority training organisation, again, we will be able to take some of that credit to be able to give credit for the training they've already done. And that's mostly for basic training. But certainly this is about not giving people a situation where they're in the process of carrying out training or whatever, and then not being able to complete that because of an arbitrary date at the end of the year. So this is about, this recognition period is about giving that person some time to be able to get that sorted out. But please bear in mind in the situation that these approvals, that we only accept EU or EASA approvals which were issued and approved prior to the 1st of January. So that is an important factor in terms of the recognition period. It's only to sort of say what we have today will be the ability to carry on for a period of time afterwards. Next slide, please. So in real terms, the situation we have now really is about trying to give you a simple process in terms of nothing that you have to do to manage your approval. The practical situation that you have to then deal with is the changeover to the new format certificate of recognition. And then your big decision really is if you need to access the European market, do you need to continue and ask EASA for a third country organisation approval? That's something you need to talk to them. A lot of that detail is on their website and so forth. And I know some of you have already applied, so we are aware of that. And then making sure that you're talking to the students and organisations you're doing training on behalf to ensure that they understand the differences with the CAA form 148, 149, and is that acceptable to those local authorities that may be being asked to apply that to a licence in their country. Next slide, please. So I think that really concludes what I have to say in terms of the changes for the 147s. So I think I'll hand back to Will now to talk if anyone's got any questions.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Steve. I'm sure everyone will agree that that was a very informative session. We've already had one question which Damien's helpfully responded to. The question for everyone's reference was, should an approved Part 147 organisation decide they don't require a CAA approval, can they work entirely within the rules of an EASA third country approval with no UK oversight? And Damien's response, if you can't see it, is if you no longer decide to maintain a UK approval and you hold an EASA TCO approval only, then the oversight of that approval will be carried out by EASA and not the UK CAA.
The one important thing about that, and that's a good question actually, is if people are thinking that they can just go for an EASA approval, which is fine if they're only working in the European market. But if they were to try use that EASA approval within the UK, then bear in mind, as I said earlier on, the approval will be from EASA will be issued after the 31st of December 2020. Therefore, would not be allowed to be used in the UK under the saving legislation. And eventually, if you want to be able to use even after the 2 years, you will then need a UK approval after 2 years if there is no bilateral agreement. So it's important to see that.
Great, thank you. We've had a few more questions come in, Mark, so I'll start reading them out. The first is, where is the MTOE template?
So the MTOE doesn't change. So the only thing it's going to change is the C of R template. They're already prepared, and we will send them out and put them on the microsite after the webinar.
Thank you. Should you still be quoting, this one might be for Steve Horton actually, should you still be quoting EU EC regulations on the CAA form?
Yes, as I said in my slides, the current reference that you can see in the EU regulation is the same reference that you'll be using once we go past the 31st of December. That whole reference number remains unchanged. So where it's quoted in our documentation, it will be the same reference as it is today.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question in, what would you be auditing against, Mark?
Okay, so the fundamentals are, it will still be part 147. The only difference will be, instead of the legislation being enacted via the European Commission, as Steve said earlier on, it will be enacted via the European Union Withdrawal Act and the statutory instruments that support that. So the auditing of an organisation by the CAA will be done in accordance with that documentation, rather than the European Commission specific details. But essentially, everything is the same. There is very subtle differences, as I said, but what we do on a day-to-day basis, what you do, what we do in terms of oversight is exactly the same, just about.
Great, thank you. Has there been any progress on the decision for EASA to recognise CAA CORs post-January 2021?
Steve, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, there's been no movement whatsoever. As mentioned, the negotiations are currently taking place, and until those have come to a conclusion, we've had no communication between the CAA and EASA. But I would suggest that there will be no recognition of those from an EASA point of view. We can't speak for them. We can only speak for ourselves.
Great, thanks, Steve. The next question, which I can quickly answer, is, so to clarify, even if we have a yes deal, exit from the EU, the CAA is leaving EASA, is that correct? Yes, that is correct. That was a decision made by the UK government earlier this year, I think in March. So regardless of whether there is a deal or a no deal, the UK will be leaving the European Aviation Safety System from the end of this year. Next one, if we hold an EASA TCO and CAA approval, will the CAA complete oversight audits as is currently the case, or will we be audited by EASA for TC approval and CAA for UK?
So it will be the latter of the two there. So EASA will look after their approval, and the UK CAA will look after the oversight for the UK approval. Unless something happens in the future where an agreement is made, then that will be the circumstances.
Great, thank you. If students do all their training before 31 December, do their theory exams in January, what certificate do they get?
So they will get a CA form 148, 149, depending on what type of training they'll do, because the training was completed after the deadline. So one of the key things here is that if any training has to be applied to an EU license, shall we say, that needs to be completed beforehand, before the 31st of December, to allow that to be happening. Any training completed after that will be a CE only UK focused certificate of recognition.
Thank you, Mark. Further to an earlier question raised, how long do the UK CAA propose to accept EASA issued 148, 149 certificates? 2 years, or are we waiting to understand if there will be an agreement?
So at the moment, as per the legislation, it will be up to 2 years. So those organisations that are already currently approved in the EASA system or EU system will continue to be able to use EU C of Rs to apply to an UK licence holder's licence. If an organization, a new organization is created in the EU, that would not be acceptable. So they couldn't use their CFRs. So it's very much about trying to sort of balance, the situation of not giving people who may already be in courses or finishing off courses, or they're finishing their OJT as an example, and making life difficult for them. That's where the balance comes from.
Thank you, Mark. This might be one for Steve. I think you might need to clarify this one, though. Will the CAA add any additional regulations to EASA regulations during the transitional period? I think that probably means after the transition period.
Okay, so if we're talking post 31st of December, no, there are no plans to add additional requirements. As I said, there will be a rulemaking plan published before the end of the year, so you will have visibility of the rule changes that we are planning for 2021, and basically that is just catch up on EU legislation that that is applicable early next year. So no, we will not be adding any additional requirements to the regulations.
Thank you. Mark, as a current EASA 147 based outside of the UK EU, have the processes been established for obtaining a UK 147 to operate in the UK and provide training to UK airlines MROs?
Yes, we have. So the application process is already open, and on the 1st of January, then those, if you are successful, then we will validate and activate those approvals from the 1st of January onwards. So the application process is available on the CAA external website, and you can apply today.
Could you please clarify the validity? I think you might have already answered this, but could you please clarify the validity of the Part 66 modules passed before 1 January 2021? Will they still be 10 years since the day the engineer passed them? And will also 3 years apply for type certificates?
Okay, so for Part 66 modules, the 10-year rule still stays, because as we said earlier on, all the legislation we have in Europe today is passed over to the UK, and therefore the same timeframes and so forth are still there. The saving legislation within the statutory instrument gives us the ability to be able to then also look at people who have done modules within the EU and then want to then still get their UK license. So again, that is about sort of helping out the individual so that they don't have to repeat. So if they've done your modules in the EU or you've done your modules in the UK, then they will still be able to be used. And the 10-year rule and the 3-year rule for the type training is still applicable because that's part of the legislation.
Thank you. Regarding working in the UK with no UK oversight, can an EASA only approved MTO operate in the UK, that is, hold classes under the EASA approval and issue EASA certificates of recognition for EASA license endorsement? The writer of this question understood that these can't be used for UK AML endorsement.
Yes, is the answer, because it's not our policy in the UK CAA to limit businesses in any way. So an EASA have the ability to be able to provide an EU EASA approval, third country approval, to other countries. And so therefore there's an EASA approved 147 organizations all over the world. So the fundamental fact is when we leave on the 31st of December, we become a third country. Therefore, anyone can apply for a third country approval from EASA in the UK.
Wonderful. More questions still coming through. If an EASA audit took place of a Part 147, would the CAA recognise the audit outcomes, or would it be a duplication of effort?
Okay, so the fundamentals of the law says that we do not take credit. Okay, so because that's a different type of approval, and our approval is a UK-centric approval. So the reality is, in the fundamentals of what we're doing, because we do not have any, the potential is we do not have any working arrangements or an agreement which then would overcome that law, then we cannot share that type of oversight. Now, whether that changes in the future will depend on what happens in the coming months.
Has the CAA established relationships with other overseas authorities about them moving over to the UK CAA and leaving EASA? That might be a good one for Steve.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, Steve.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, excuse the dog barking in the background. Has the CAA established relationships with other overseas authorities about them moving over to the UK CAA and leaving EASA?
So it's in relation to us leaving EASA. Yes, we have got other arrangements that are in place, and we are currently negotiating some. So we have arrangements in place between the UK, the US, Canada, Brazil, Japan. We are currently, as you know, in negotiations with the EU for a UK-EU arrangement, and we're currently in negotiations with the Singapore Authority for a UK-Singapore agreement. So those are the ones that are either agreed or are in negotiation process at the moment.
Thanks, Steve. We will need to issue 2 CORs for EASA TCO and UK CAA for each student after January 1, 2021, assuming we hold EASA TCO. Can someone from the CAA side confirm whether that is the case?
So the situation there is, I mean, it's dependent on the person with regard to his or her license, whether that's in the EU or in the UK or somewhere else. But the reality is that if someone didn't have a license, say for instance, and was doing a training course, then yes, you would have to issue both certificates. If it was type training and you already knew the person was an EU license holder, then it would be irrelevant sending them the CAA. You would only issue the EASA one. But you could do it if you wanted to. So the reality is that, you know, it depends on the person, but as a rule of thumb, then you would issue both certificates, and then that would cover both approvals.
And approval of instructors would continue as now, but an EASA license would not be required. Is it?
So the approval of instructors is a situation where, you know, that stays exactly the same. So we're still using CAT 1528, if I remember right, the number properly. And, you know, so the license it's not an EASA license. It's, you know, it's a license in terms of an engineer's maintenance license, aircraft engineer's license, whether that be UK or EASA or so forth. So it's just a methodology of proving someone's knowledge. And that's really what we're trying to achieve there. So there may be some subtle changes around that area going forward, so that it gives people a little bit more flexibility.
Thanks, Mark. There is a question here about alternative means of compliance, and that there was mention of this week, and what is that? I'm not completely sure on the intention of this question, Steve, but perhaps you could just give a quick line on your ideal response to that question.
Okay. Alternate means of compliance and guidance material is what currently supports the EASA regulations. So it's the acceptable mean. If you meet the AMC, then you meet the intent of the rule. Now, the EU regulations are coming across with the SI under the Withdrawal Act. AMC and GM are not coming across in that method. And the reason for that is if we brought it across under the SI, it will put it into UK law, and AMC and GM is not law. So that is coming across by a different method. It's a CAA decision to bring that across. So on around about Christmas time, we will be issuing a CAA decision which brings across the AMC and GM as it is at that time. Remembering what I said earlier, it's the rules that are in force and applicable on the 31st of December. So we have to match the AMC and GM at the same time. So current EASA, AMC and GM will be applicable to UK law once we get past the 31st of December.
And I think, Steve, we'll stay with you as it's a nice segue into this question, which is, will CAPS, the CAA's publications, remain as guidance material, or do they become a regulatory instrument?
No, there is no change in the status of the regulations, the AMC, the GM, or the CAPS. Everything stays as it is today.
Great. We have two more questions left, unless there are any others that are going to come in that time. The first is, do we need two MTOEs if we are CAA and EASA TCO approved?
So that's quite a difficult one to actually answer at the moment, because obviously you've got the CAA approved one at the moment, and that has been acceptable in Europe for being able to have mutual recognition. What EASA decides to do post the 1st of January is entirely up to themselves, because they have their user guides, their 4147 user guides, which obviously specifies a standard of exposition. Now, whether they insist on having a separate one or a supplement is entirely up to them. The conversations we've had in the past, it looks like it may well be a separate one, but as I say, I can't guarantee which way they're going to go. That's a conversation with them. At the moment, the UK approved MTOE will continue as it is at the moment.
And Mark, I think the final question is fairly closely related to that, which is, will the UK seek a separate MTOE if the organisation holds EASA approval? Could there be an option in the future for a supplement?
I think it really depends on how we end up with a potential agreement, or whether we end up in a situation where they're completely separate approvals. So currently, if you apply today, that it will be a separate MTOE, because you've got to have the different templates. Now, whether as we progress over the next few months, and even up to a year, whether that then becomes a simpler process that we put together with regards to giving some guidance that says a supplement with the deltas would be acceptable. That needs to be developed as we go forward.
Great. Well, they're all the questions that have been submitted by our participants. Unless we get any in the next 30 seconds, I think it's probably time we close this session. I hope everyone's found it an informative session. And obviously, I'd like to thank all of our participants. Oh, we've got one more question. This will be the final one. Will there be a new scheme of charges issued, and will it differ from what we have now? I'm not sure if Steve,
I'll answer that one.
Okay.
So scheme of charges as it stands today will remain in place, and they will be the same scheme of charges for both UK organisations and those applying from overseas. The CAA is already looking at how do we change the scheme of charges in the future, but that is somewhere off probably into 2021 to 2022. And it depends on obviously the circumstances that happen over the next 12 months. So at the moment, scheme of charges is as per it stands today, and there's no changes envisaged in 2021 at the moment.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you to our panelists for taking the time to run us through this, as well as answering the questions there at the end. We hope you've all found it very useful indeed. As I said at the top of this call, this is part of a series of webinars that we're running throughout November. Most of them are relevant to the aerospace industry, and you can find more information about them at our dedicated EU exit microsite, which is info.caa.co.uk/EU exit. But I'm sure you're all very well aware of that microsite indeed. Many thanks, and I wish you a good afternoon.